Last week, Christ asked his disciples and all of us, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? And the very next words from his mouth are the parable we hear today with regard to one's own righteousness. In short, the self-righteous Pharisee takes great account of how he acted in comparison to the real sinners that are all around him. But the exalted man, the tax collector, acutely aware of his own sins and not measuring himself against others, bows down before God and says, "Be merciful to me, a sinner." He indeed is justified, freed from his sin, while the self-righteous hypocrite is not. I've heard the same scenario play out time and time again in the public arena and even in personal conversations that I've had. How so many people absolve themselves of wrongdoing because other people are doing much worse than me. So their sins really aren't that bad, in comparison, of course. Or how people will condone the sins of others because it isn't like I'm killing anyone or stealing anything. I'm sure you've all heard that excuse. Maybe you've even let it slip out of your mouth once or twice to make your conscience feel better. It's not like I murdered anyone, as if that's a litmus test for holiness. On the contrary, we ought to not be comparing ourselves to others at all. This is exactly what we spoke about last week in the disease of relativism. Our actions, our sins are right or wrong on their own merits, independent of what others do or think or don't do or don't think. Our actions are not measured against a popular vote or consensus or what everyone else is doing, but against truth, which is unchanging and objective. The extreme irony of this parable ought to jump right out to us as well. That Jesus uses a Pharisee and a tax collector to illustrate his point. A Pharisee who is supposed to be a religious man, a scholar of God's law, and a holy man. And a tax collector who by profession is the most feared and brutal of all persons in the Roman Empire, probably second only to the soldiers of the centurion. And yet, it is the tax collector who repents in humility to God for his actions, and the Pharisee who excuses his own sin. Now, to this point of the year, we, the priests, haven't really said anything about the upcoming election. And everybody always gets very defensive when it comes election time, either one side or the other. And they don't feel like we should talk about it in church. However, we are called to be a people of Christian faith living in the world, ultimately to transform the world around us. So, is it really an unreasonable expectation that a pope or bishops or priests in charge of the education and formation of people, entrusted to their spiritual care, would not provide guidance when it comes to fulfilling the civic duty of a faithful Christian? I suspect that most people get uncomfortable because perhaps we all have a little bit of the Pharisee inside of us, and we prefer to look at other people and dwell on the errors of everyone else, and perhaps not really want to address our own problems or our own cooperation in whatever might be wrong with our world today. Now, all of that being said, there is, of course, no perfect candidate in our political system. In fact, there's no perfect political system at all. St. Thomas Aquinas takes up this question in his Summa Theologica, and he does not come, this may shock Americans, but he does not come to the conclusion that a representative democracy or any democracy is the best form of government. but rather, he says, a benevolent monarchy, one in which is ruled by a loving and just king, because this is the nearest and truest reflection of heaven itself. However, he admits, in its application, this is almost impossible to attain due to the sinful inclinations of man. And in more recent centuries, popes have shown a favoritism towards democracy for its inherent system of checks and balances that can hold those in power accountable and lessen the likelihood of corruption. However, concupiscence as it is, and man's propensity to sin as it is, democracy is far from perfect, as even a majority or a plurality of citizens can decide on a law that is objectively immoral and contrary to the divine law. And even though it may be accepted as the civil law of the land, it could be by definition unjust and therefore invalid if it contradicts God's law and God's plan. St. John Paul II, whose feast day is today, by the way, writes that democracy cannot be idolized to the point of making it a substitute for morality or a panacea for immorality. He goes on, it is therefore urgently necessary for the future of society and the development of a sound democracy to rediscover those essential and innate human and moral values which flow from the very truth of the human being and express and safeguard the dignity of the person. Values which no individual, no majority, and no state can ever create, modify, or destroy, but must only acknowledge, respect, and promote. And here is where we must focus our individual attention, our civic responsibility, in fulfilling our duty as citizens. And so here I turn to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, lest anyone accuse me of lobbying for any particular political party or candidate. Citizens are to live as free men and women, yet without using this freedom as a pretext for evil, but to rather live as servants of God. Loyal collaboration between citizens and the government is at times a duty between citizens to voice just criticisms of what seems harmful to the dignity of persons and the good of the community. Submission to the authority and co-responsibility for the common good make it morally obligatory to pay taxes, to exercise the right to vote, and defend one's country. So as you see, the Catechism tells us we do have a moral obligation to vote. Many people do not take that obligation very seriously. The citizen is obliged in conscience not to follow the directives of civil authorities when they are contrary to the demands of the moral order, to the fundamental rights of persons, or the teachings of the gospel. Refusing obedience to civil authorities when their demands are contrary to those of an upright conscience finds its justification in the distinction between serving God and the political community. Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. We must obey God rather than men. It is a part of the church's mission to pass moral judgments even in matters related to politics, whether the fundamental rights of men or the salvation of souls requires it. This means the means, and the only means, that the church may use are those which are in accord with the gospel and the welfare of all men, according to the diversity of times and circumstances. The efforts of the state to curb the spread of behavior harmful to people's rights and the basic rules of civil society correspond to the requirement of safeguarding the common good. Legitimate public authority has the right and the duty to inflict punishment proportionate to the gravity of the offense. But punishment, however, has the primary aim of redressing the disorder introduced by the offense. When it is willingly accepted by the guilty party, it assumes the value of expiation. Punishment then, in addition to defending the public order and protecting people's safety, has a medicinal purpose. And as far as possible, it must contribute to the correction of the guilty party. The inalienable right to life of every innocent human individual is a constitutive element of a civil society and its legislation. The inalienable rights of the person must be recognized and respected by civil society and the political authority. These human rights depend neither on single individuals nor on parents, nor do they represent a concession made by society and the state. They belong to human nature and are inherent in the person by virtue of the creative act from which the person took his origin. Among such fundamental rights, one should mention in this regard is every human being's right to life and the physical integrity from the moment of conception until death. The moment a positive law or an enacted law deprives a human or a category of human beings from the protection which civil legislation ought to afford them, the state is denying the equality of all before the law. When the state does not place its power at the service of the rights of each citizen, and in particularly the most vulnerable, the very foundations of a state based on law are undermined. As a consequence of the respect and protection which must be ensured for the unborn child from the moment of conception, the law must provide appropriate sanctions for every deliberate violation of the child's rights. Scandal is an attitude or behavior which leads another to evil. The person who gives scandal becomes his neighbor's tempter. He damages virtue and integrity. He may even draw his brother into spiritual death. Scandal is a grave offense if by deed or omission another is deliberately led into a grave offense. Scandal can be provoked by laws or institutions, by fashion or opinion. Therefore, they are guilty of scandal who establish laws or social structures leading to the decline of morals and the corruption of religious practice, or to the social conditions that intentionally or not make Christian conduct and obedience to the commandments difficult and practically impossible. This is also true of business leaders who make rules encouraging fraud, teachers who provoke their children to anger, or manipulators of public opinion who turn it away from moral values. Pope Francis, in his 2016 apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, writes, "Here I feel it urgent to state that if the family is the sanctuary of life, the place where life is conceived and cared for, it is a horrendous contradiction when it becomes a place where life is rejected and destroyed. So great is the value of a human life, and so inalienable the right to life of an innocent child growing in a mother's womb, that no alleged right to one's body can justify a decision to terminate that life, which is an end in itself, and which can never be considered the property of another human being. The family," the Pope continues, "protects human life in all its stages, including the last." St. John Paul II, again, his feast day today, says that in the case of an intrinsically unjust law, such as the law permitting abortion or euthanasia, it is never licit to obey it or to take part in propaganda campaigns in favor of such laws or to vote for it. Of course, abortion is not the only issue to consider. But the U.S. bishops, in listing the 10 most important issues for Catholics to be concerned about when going into the ballot box to vote, list abortion and euthanasia as preeminent. Webster's dictionary tells us that preeminent means having paramount rank, dignity, or importance. And while the other issues are indeed important, attacks on family life, religious liberty, marriage, war, death penalty, immigration, poverty, conscience protection, healthcare, taxes, and the pursuit of peace on earth, none of these, or all of these combined, can be used to justify a capitulation on the preeminent need to end the unbridled assault on human dignity in its most vulnerable stages. I'm not worried about the babies that have been aborted. We hear in our first reading, the Lord hears the cry of the poor. The church teaches that baptized in their blood, their innocence ensures them entrance into heaven. I'm worried about us as a society and a church who fails to acknowledge this slaughter and fails to do anything about it. The Pharisee in our gospel says, hey, it's not like I killed anyone, so that's not so bad. The tax collector, who very well may have killed people in his life or at least contributed to their deaths by his actions, repents and amends his life. He is exalted. The Pharisee is not. Votes for president, Senate, House of Representatives, governor, state house, local representatives are of vital importance in our participation in our world, and they mark how well we've competed or whether or not we've kept the faith. St. Paul says, the Lord will bring me safe to his heavenly kingdom, but that is only true for those who have faith. So again, the question harkens in our ears, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? And I guess for us in the upcoming weeks, that depends. That depends on our willingness to live the faith out in all aspects of our life, even at the ballot box.